let's talk about nut slots here for a minute. And I have addressed nut slots in various other videos. There's parts of those videos I don't think I've ever put it all together into one video. So here we go. Okay, so your nut slot is the slot that holds the strings, right? Right here. Here's your nut slot. Common questions are, how deep should the nut slots be, and how do I get there? All right, so you may have heard the phrase that the nut slot should be fret height. And let me show you why that is so, and then I will show you how you get there. The reason it should be the height of the fret and not any higher is because, watch what happens. Let me show you the principle of this thing, okay? You've got to understand the principle that's going on here, and then it will be obvious as to why the nut should be the same as the fret. First of all, it took me years to actually get this concept. And John Arnold tried to drill it into me, and the problem was I misunderstood him at first. When he said fret height, I was thinking that would be fingerboard height, you know. It just took me a minute to grasp the concept. So I understand that people have some trouble sometimes with the concept. So basically, take your string here and you fret it at any fret. Let's go to the 3rd fret, okay? And let's fret it right here. Right there at the 3rd fret. How high is the string at the 4th fret? Well, it's determined by the action, but that's a variable, okay? What it's really determined by right here is the height of this fret. So this fret is a fret. So you move yourself back to the 2nd fret here and you fret it, and you've got a certain height right here at the 4th fret. You've got that action right there. Okay? You move your finger back to the 1st fret, and your string should be this high. Now if you move your finger back to the nut, how high should that string be? Well, it should be exactly the same as if there was a fret right underneath there. So in other words, the nut is a parking garage for an invisible 0 fret. You could have a 0 fret on there, and it would basically be just another fret, just like any of these other frets. So let me show you another example of that. I'm going to zoom the camera in here so that you can see the fingerboard a little bit better and a little less of me. And maybe you can see this. But you need to get your guitar out and study this. You have to figure this out for yourself sometimes, okay? But I'm going to zoom in here. All right, we're zoomed in on this now. So let's say you're a bluegrass guy, and you play with a capo a lot. So let's put this capo here on the 4th fret on this guitar. And all I'm doing is illustrating the same principle I just showed you a second ago, but I'm going to do it on a broader scale now. So you've got this capo here on the 4th fret, like this. So where's your nut at this point in the deal? You got a nut back here, right? But this is really the nut right here. And how high are the strings off of the fingerboard? They are fret height, right? So if I go back here, for instance, and let's say I'm going to do this. In fact, let's take a feeler gauge set, and I'm going to jack it into here. I'm going to make this nut excessively high. So this guitar now has basically really high nut slots because I've jammed finger feeler gauges into it. What happened right here? Nothing, you know? So you have really high nut slots right now, and it didn't change this one bit because the capo is the nut. Okay? I'm going to pull those out. So if I back this capo up here to the 2nd fret, where's the nut on this guitar now? It's the capo. And how high are the strings off of the fingerboard right now? Fret height. Right? So a lot of people say this, well, if I set the nut slots at fret height, is it going to buzz? Is it going to reduce volume? Well, not unless playing with the capo does. And if your strings buzz with the capo, what you need to raise is the saddle. You need to raise the strings like this. Where are we? We need to raise the strings like that. And you need to raise this action right here, because the capo is your nut in this example. All right, so let's take this capo and let's park it back over here, right over the nut, just like this. Okay? Where's the nut now? Well, the nut is the nut. How high should the strings be off of the fingerboard here? Fret height. Okay? So that's the principle here. The only reason that you would really want to have this any higher, and I'm going to come over here, I'm going to bring this right off of here, and I'm going to set this right on top of the nut so that we have a really high nut slot at this point. This low E string is super, super high right now. Alright? That's not going to gain you anything here. All that's going to do, actually, if you try to fret at the first fret, it's going to pull this string out of tune because it's got so far to go. So if I have this really high fret slot right there, and I put a capo back on the 4th fret again, like this, and clamp it down, how high is that string off of the fingerboard now? Fret height. Okay? So, I have no logical reason to see why the nut slots should be any higher than the fret height, except 2 reasons. You might want to allow for a little bit of wear because the nut is bone or ivory or something like that, and it may wear over time. So you may want to set it maybe 0.02 of an inch higher if you wanted to. I generally don't. I set it just smidgen. And you can actually even go just a smidgen low and you probably still won't buzz, but set it at fret height. So how do we get it at fret height? Well, there's a couple ways to do that. One way, the real quick and dirty way, is to fret your string right here in between the 2nd and the 3rd frets, and it should just barely clear the 1st fret. And I mean, on this guitar, I'm tapping it, okay? You can hear that tap, I can. And this one just so absolutely barely clears. That's one way to do it. Now, the logic behind that is this. Okay, you got to get your guitar and prove this yourself. Hold the string right here between the 2nd and the 3rd frets, and then come up here and hold it between whatever this is, the 5th and the 6th frets, so that your string is actually touching the 3rd fret and is actually touching the 5th fret, okay? What you've done here is you've created a straight edge from this fret to this fret. And this gap right here is non-existent. That string is actually touching that fret, as it should. So, let's scoot this back one. And again, the string is touching that fret. There's no clearance. Tiny, tiny, tiny bit right there. And that's probably because I'm pushing down on the string hard and I'm causing the string to bend up a little bit. If I do this really lightly, tiny clearance. I'm going to bow back one more. Do the same thing. Very, very, very tiny. Alright, now I'm going to come back to here, and my finger's now going to go onto the nut slot, which would be a fret at this point, and then that has your clearance. Well, it ought to be the same as all of these examples. It ought to be the same as this one. It ought to be the same as this one. And it ought to be the same as this one. And then you come back to here, and that ought to be the same as all of those. So that's the principle there as to why you use this technique, which a lot of people don't understand. They just they don't explain. They just say, oh, put it here, and it should be barely touching. Well, I just want you to see for yourself why. What is the logic behind that? And that is the logic. You know, you fret here, fret here, fret here, you move back here. Pretty soon your finger's on the nut slot, and that should be fret height. Now, when you're cutting nut slots with your files, how do you get it there? Well, one way is to use this gap method, and you just keep filing down your nut slot. And let me grab a file real quick. When you're doing your nut slots, you want to bisect this angle from the string. The string has a plane and a plane, and you want to bisect that angle about like that. And generally, I just put a finger underneath like this, and I'm going to get it automatically. But you want to bisect that angle, and you're filing your fret slot down there, and you check this, and when you get to that gap, you stop. And that's one reason why people stop a little bit high, is because they're afraid of going too far, and they cut the nut slot too low, and then they ruined it, and then they got to go all over again. So they stop just a hair short, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, let me show you a second technique to do this. And that technique is, well, I'm going to use a capo here again because it's easy. Put your capo on the 2nd fret. Get your feeler gauges out. And I don't care what the action is. This is going to be a geometrical thing. And so it's going to work with whatever action you have here. Action, okay? I keep missing the camera. The height of the string, the height of the saddle. This guitar is a very, very low action right now. It's 76 thousandths of an inch. What you do is you get your feeler gauges out. This is a 12. And you come over here and you measure the gap. I have a capo here. You measure this gap at the next fret. And I have 12 is just pushing it. So it's probably 10. And this set of gauges doesn't have a 10 in it. I need to get a 10 back in here. But here's an 11 and an 8. Let's see if 11 will clear. So I'm measuring this gap here. And it doesn't quite. An 8's going to clear. Maybe. Well, 8 clears, but gosh, barely. No? So that gap right there is 8 thousandths of an inch. So with the capo on the 2nd fret, the gap at the 3rd fret is 8 thousandths of an inch. Take your capo and move it back here to the 1st fret. Measure here at the 2nd fret. And now it's bigger than 8 thousandths, and I bet it's. Let's try the 11 and the 12 again. I can't get the 12 in there. I can't get the 12. $11 goes, but let's just call it 10, okay? So you had an 8, you had a 10, and now if I take the capo off and put it up here at the nut, then what should the gap right here at the 1st fret be with the string open? If this is 8 and this is 10, what should this be? 12. Okay? I mean, that's a logical progression. And the thing is, I have done this hundreds of times. I have gone the entire fingerboard. And I made a map of the fingerboard. So I have done this many, many, many times. And I know that that you can get by with just doing 2 frets, 2 or 3 frets, to see, what that increase should be. So I feel pretty comfortable in saying that this is 8, 10, and then the low E open should be 12. Let's see what we got here. 12. We still on camera? Yeah. And 12 goes. 12 is perfect. So as far as I'm concerned, this nut slot, at least that one, is perfect. Righty? It should be. I mean, I did it. So, but seriously, that's how you can accurately drop that nut slot exactly where you want it, reliably, repeatably, accurately. And it's going to vary for each string because your action goes down across this fingerboard. So this action is 76 and it drops down to about 60 down on this side. So the action is lower right here. So you need to measure each string and set each nut slot at the right place. And after you've done this, hundreds of times, you'll be able to jump to it pretty quick. I generally just measure like the first, the second one. I fret the first fret and I measure the second, and then I just add 0.02 of an inch to that, maybe 0.04 if I want just a little bit more, just for security's sake, So, but there's two ways that you can do your nut slots. You can hold it down here on the fret like this, and you can keep filing so you have just a tiny gap, or you can actually measure it and you can drop it. I like to measure for my final setup, and the reason is it's a lot easier for me to measure a 0.12 of an inch gap than it is a gnat's hair of a gap. And so if you get half of a gnat hair, you might have blown it. You might be down at 0.10 of an inch, and you should have been 12. So, and conversely, if you have two gnat's hairs on there, you might have 14 or 16 thousandths of an inch, and you could drop just a little bit more to get that final slinkiness, okay? So that's why I like to use the feeler gauges. But I don't just measure here. I extrapolate back, and I call that the extrapolation technique. Because I'm extrapolating, I'm mapping the fingerboard, I'm mapping the frets is what I'm doing. I'm measuring, and then I have a measurement here that I can extrapolate those numbers back to, and that's where that nut slot should be for that one. So, okay? So that's how you get there, and that's why you're doing it that way. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, it depends on the player's preferences on the nut slot. Well, why? Why would a guy want to have a nut that's way higher than the fretted note? You're just making it hard to play. There's one reason why you might, and that's if you play slide. If you play slide, you might want that higher so you'd have the clearance. But, my resonator guitar is a round neck resonator guitar, and I do play with fingers on it and a slide. And the nuts are higher on that, so that it clears better. But if you only play slide occasionally, you can stick something under here and raise your strings up and pop them up. Go look at Leonard Skinner, Washington. Gary Washington, would do that on Freebird. You can see him with a piece of rubber or something underneath the strings right here, right in the middle where he raised the strings up on the Les Paul, popped it up there and did the slide, whips it out and retunes, and then he's back into regular going. So if you just play slide occasionally, you can do that, and you'll raise the nut slots up. But for regular play, I see no reason whatsoever to have nut slots that are higher than the fret height. So, your call. If you want a guitar that's hard to play, go for it. So, all right. Now, the last thing about nut slots while we're here is the spacing right here. There's two schools here. One is to draw equidistant lines on here. So you draw lines that are the same distance apart, and you cut your slots and you drop your strings down there. The other school is to have equal spaces. So you have an equal space between here, equal space, equal space. I very, very, very much prefer equal spaces. Equal lines, you got a big fat low E and a big fat A, and they're like this, they're close together, so that when you go to fret them, there's not much room for your fat fingers to go before it hits the A string. And I especially notice this on a B7 chord, where I've got 3 fingers in here on those fat strings, and a B7 with equal centers. Equal center to center feels very, very cramped to me. And especially if I'm playing Beaumont Rag, where you're doing the cross-picking thing here on the B7 chord, it's hard to get that really clean for me. So I very much prefer even spacing right here. The way I do that is with calipers here, and I just measure the spacing in between. And this nut's pretty good. The A and the D are just a hair tight. 2,000ths of an inch. Yeah, the A and the D are 2,000ths of an inch tighter, which is, I'm not worrying about that. If you go watch some of my other videos, you'll see where I'm evaluating guitars and I'm measuring those, and I'm getting 35 to 40,000ths of an inch difference between, say, the D and the G and the E and the A. 40,000ths of an inch is an entire D string, almost an A string difference, and that's significant. You know, I'd probably pull the line at about 5,000ths of an inch. If I was making a nut and I blew it by 5,000ths of an inch, I'd probably just redo it. And I have tricks for dropping that slot down in exactly where I want it. But that's another thing about the nuts is I prefer equal distance between the strings. It just feels so much more roomier to me. And I'm going to talk about this in a video that I'm going to do next week, setting up a Stratocaster. I've got a new Strat in the shop, and it has equal center to centers, and I can't stand it. Everything is wonderful on it except the nut slots on it. And I'm going to talk about that next time in the setting up the Strat thing. But that's something for you to consider. There again is my logic to why I want equal spacing, because I'm doing those B7 chords, the E chords. I like the extra space in between there for my fat fingers, especially if I'm doing any kind of cross-picking thing or anything like that. If you have fingers that are big enough to where you can actually fret two notes at once, like some people can do like this. I've seen people that actually do this where they take one finger and they actually fret two notes at one time. So they're making like a C chord, and they'll actually put this ring finger right there and get both of those notes. I can't do that. My fingers are, first of all, not quite that fat. And secondly, I just can't get it there, because the string is hitting on the edge. I would gladly reach up with two fingers and do that kind of thing. I just prefer that. But there's a reason why you might like that tight spacing, is if you do that sort of thing, or you frequently bar, two-note bars, I can understand that. So, last thing I would do, this is almost more of a neck reset thing, but the spacing up here from the E's to the edge, I prefer, and most of the time I would set up customers' guitars this way, to where there's slightly less distance on the low E to the edge of the fingerboard than there is to the high E. And especially on the neck reset, up here, I want a little bit more distance on the high E than I do on the low E if I'm going to make an error. I definitely don't want the high E closer to the fingerboard edge over here. I don't want it like this, because most people will pull strings down when they play. So they'll come up here and they'll pull down. Very few people push off, especially when they're reaching for these low strings clear across the fingerboard. They almost never push off. They almost always pull down. And also on the high E string, especially on an electric guitar, when you do a vibrato up there, it just, having a little more room up in here gives you a little bit more room to make that vibrato without pulling off. See, that's really comfortable. Man, I've got a lot of room in there to do that vibrato. And I hardly ever do a vibrato. Most people don't do a vibrato up here. And if they do, they can pull it down, see? Which very few people are going to push up to do that vibrato. You see? You're probably going to come up here and you're going to pull it down. And up here, you're probably going to pull up. So, same thing at the nut is I will scoot the high E just a little bit further away from the edge of the fingerboard than I will the low E. I'll put the low E just a hair closer. And by hair, I mean maybe a 5 to 10,000ths of an inch at most. 10,000ths at the most. And that's a lot. So let me measure these strings just to see where I'm at, because this is my nut here. And I hope it's right. I'm going to measure in here. 30. Actually, that was 130. Yeah, 130. And 105. So I mean, I'm trying not to push the string over. So 20 thousandths of an inch. So the low E is 20 thousandths of an inch closer to the edge than the high E is. And again, the reason I do that is because most people will tend to pull strings down, and having the strings in just a little further gives you a little bit more room this way. And also, if you fret with your thumb, I want that low E to be more consistent down the edge here. The strings are going to taper in from here. On most Martin guitars, unless I do a 2 1/4 inch bridge spacing, the strings are going to taper in to the bridge. So like this. This is an exaggeration. They're going to taper like this, inwards. And so I set the low E to run more parallel to the fingerboard, and the high E will come in just a little bit more. And if you fret with your thumb, you'll like that consistency. And a lot of guys fret with the thumb, and in fact, it was a thumb fretter that told me about that one time. He said, I like it more closer to the top edge because it's more consistent for my thumb, and then you got more room for the vibrato down here. So you can control a little bit with the nut. And likewise, also with the nut, you can control a little bit about how fat the neck feels by how far apart you push the strings. How close do you push them to the edge? So what did I have here? 130 and 105. And I have had guitars as close as 90 thousandths of an inch to the edge. Most people can't handle that. Most people can't handle 90 thousandths of an inch. I had one customer who complained about that. I gave him 2 1/4 inch bridge spacing. He said he loved it, except that he was always pulling the strings off. I said, well, we could address that with a new nut that was just slightly narrower spacing right here, and it would pull these strings in here at the nut like this. It would pull them in, and that would make a pretty dramatic effect all the way up and down the neck. I tend to push the strings, pretty far out because I have very precise fingering, and I tend to push them out a little bit. Maybe on his guitar I push it just a little too far, After he made that comment, I started to get a little bit more conservative about that. And I also changed the technique that I do nuts with. And so I've been ending up with about 100 thousandths, about 120, 110 in from the edge, more consistently. So this is 130 and 105. So if I balance that out, then we would be 115. Yeah, sure, that'd be about right. And most people can handle that pretty well without pulling the strings off or anything like that. When I do frets on guitars, I also don't bevel the edges in as far as like Martin does, and certainly cheap guitars, they tend to bevel those in way like this, and you lose a lot of fretboard space, and it makes the string really easy to fall off of that bevel. I make my bevels about like this angle right here. Get on camera. About like that. Not like this, I make my bevels pretty steep, so I want to use all of the fret that you can. And then I round my edges off, to make them soft. I've had a few people say, yeah, the frets feel, a little bumpy because they're used to feeling that bevel going way in there. Well, that's just the trade-off, I'm trying to give you as much fret real estate as I can, and you really shouldn't be grabbing it like this anyways, And obviously, I'm not cutting myself. So, I feel like that's not a problem. I can feel the fret a little bit, so what? So did Doc Watson, That's how Doc Watson would find his way down the fingerboard a lot. He would feel the number of frets. He would reach over like that and feel, how far he was going, and then he would feel that. And you can watch him do this if you watch the videos. You'll see him do this, and in his head, I know he's counting the frets coming up. So I don't mind feeling a little bit of the fret right there. Helps me know that I'm on the fret. So, okay, guys, that's a lot. That's everything there is to know that I know about nut slot height, nut spacing, nut E to E space, what those things affect, how come I do what I do. And, you may have a different reason for doing it, and that is absolutely fine. But if you send a guitar to me, that's how I'm going to be setting it up unless you tell me otherwise. And then if you do that, I'm not going to like it. But seriously, when I do videos and I really, really like a guitar, it's because 9 times out of 10, I like the setup. The owner let me do what I wanted to do to the guitar to get the way I want it. And so that's why I like the guitar a lot of times. The sound is one thing, but the feel and the playability to me are absolutely key. I would say the feel and the playability are probably 75% of a guitar, and then the actual sound is the additional 25%. Because all of these guitars are going to sound good to me. I mean, they've all got. This is a D35, Uh, I mean, that's a good guitar, period. Yeah, it's not a pre-war D28, but a D35 is a good guitar. And so it's just automatically going to be a good guitar. And then what pushes it over the edge for me is the playability, the feel, and things like that. And you'll hear me comment all the time that I like this neck, or this neck's a little skinny. Those are the things that make it quite not so comfortable for me. Okay? All right. Nuts lots.